Carrie Buck's story begins in poverty, hardship, and neglect. The kind of beginnings that so often left young women vulnerable in early 20th century America. Born in Virginia in 1906, Carrie was the daughter of Emma Buck, a woman who herself had struggled to survive on the margins of society. Emma was described by officials and social workers in demeaning terms, branded as feeble-minded and unfit. These labels were rarely based on scientific or medical proof, but on prejudice, poverty, and the biases of the time. Carrie's early years were shaped by instability, separation from her mother, and placement in foster care. It was here that she began to experience the injustices that would define her life. By her teenage years, Carrie had been placed with foster parents who outwardly appeared to provide stability. Yet within that home she endured mistreatment and exploitation. When she was still just a teenager, she was raped by her foster father, an assault that resulted in pregnancy. Rather than being supported, believed, or protected, Carrie was punished. She was institutionalized at the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded in Lynchburg, branded with the same label as her mother. Her pregnancy, the result of sexual violence, was twisted into evidence of her moral and mental unfitness. The victim of abuse was turned into the accused, and she became the target of one of the most notorious legal battles in American history. In 1924, Virginia had passed a sterilization law as part of the wider eugenics movement spreading across the United States. Eugenics, cloaked in the language of science, argued that undesirable traits could be bred out of the population by preventing those deemed unfit from reproducing. In practice, it targeted the poor, minorities, immigrants, people with disabilities, and women like Carrie. The law was challenged, and Carrie's case was chosen deliberately as the test. She was not selected randomly, she was handpicked, because she represented what the state wanted to showcase: 3 generations of supposed degeneracy. Her mother, and her infant daughter Vivian would be placed under a magnifying glass to justify one of the darkest Supreme Court rulings ever handed down. Carrie was told little of what was happening around her. She had virtually no say in her legal defense, no real power to argue her case. Lawyers assigned to represent her were aligned with the state, their purpose less to defend her than to ensure the sterilization law would stand. It was a staged process, a mockery of justice. Her daughter Vivian, just a baby, was studied and observed, and already labeled feeble-minded despite being far too young for such judgments. The goal was clear: to create a narrative that Carrie, like her mother, and like her child, belonged to a lineage of imbecility. The case moved through the courts until it reached the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court. What should have been Carrie's chance for justice became instead a devastating betrayal. In 1927, the court handed down its infamous decision in Buck v. Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, delivered words that would echo through history: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. With that brutal sentence, the court upheld Virginia's sterilization law and legitimized forced sterilizations across the United States. The decision was chilling not only in its cruelty, but in its finality. It gave the full force of law to a system that allowed the state to strip people of their most basic human right: the ability to have children based on subjective, discriminatory judgments. Carrie Buck became a symbol not of justice, but of the dangerous intersection of pseudoscience, prejudice, and unchecked power. Her body became law, her life sacrificed to an ideology. The ruling was not merely an abstract principle. It had immediate, devastating consequences. In the wake of Buck v. Bell, thousands of sterilizations were carried out under the cover of legality. Across Virginia and other states, men and women were brought into hospitals and institutions and subjected to procedures that ended their ability to have children, often without their full knowledge or consent. For Carrie, the sterilization was both physical and symbolic. She had already endured the trauma of abuse, the injustice of being institutionalized for her foster father's crime, and the stripping away of her voice in court. Now, Her ability to ever have another child was permanently removed. She was told it was for the greater good, that her supposed flaws could not be allowed to pass to future generations. Her daughter Vivian, meanwhile, was placed with a foster family. Tragically, Vivian would die at the age of 8, never knowing the role she played in legitimizing the suffering of thousands. The coldness of the ruling was matched by the indifference of those in power. Holmes's infamous phrase was more than rhetoric, it was the embodiment of the eugenics ideology, a belief that human lives could be categorized, measured, and controlled. It was the state taking ownership of a woman's body and declaring it unworthy. And it was not an isolated incident. What happened to Carrie was part of a broader campaign, one that saw sterilization laws passed in more than 30 states, one that led to nearly 70,000 people sterilized in the United States by the mid-20th century. Carrie's ordeal was not widely discussed in her own time. Too many. She was just another patient, another case in the system. But history has since looked back and recognized the enormity of what was done to her. She became a symbol, not only of the cruelty of the eugenics movement, but of the dangers of unchecked authority and the misuse of science. Her story forces us to ask how such a decision could be made, how a Supreme Court known as a guardian of justice could sanction something so horrific. It shows us how easily law can be twisted when prejudice is given the weight of authority. Carrie's life after sterilization was marked by quiet resilience. She was eventually released from the institution and tried to live as normal a life as she could. Despite the shadow that the court's ruling cast over her existence, she married twice, worked, and tried to carve out dignity in a world that had denied her so much. Yet the weight of history followed her. She would forever be remembered not for her individuality, her humanity, or her resilience, but for a sentence that reduced her family to 3 generations of imbeciles. This was the burden she carried, one that spoke to the larger injustice suffered by so many others whose names we do not know. Behind every sterilization was a person with hopes, fears, and dreams, people whose lives were rewritten by policies that sought to erase them from the future. Carrie Buck's case was the door that allowed those lives to be stolen legally and efficiently under the banner of progress. Carrie's ordeal is remembered today not only because it marked a legal precedent, but because it shows how the machinery of justice can be weaponized against the vulnerable. Her case continues to echo through discussions of bioethics, human rights, and the limits of state power. It reminds us that progress without humanity is cruelty, and that law without compassion is a tool of oppression. Carrie's story is a warning carved into history by pain and silence. Carrie's story did not end with the court's decision or the forced sterilization she endured. What came after was a life marked by silence, stigma, and invisibility. Once the surgery was completed, she was released from the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, but she carried with her scars that could never heal. She lived most of her life in poverty, never able to have children. Her basic right to motherhood stolen under the guise of public good. Society branded her unworthy, and in many ways, erased her existence from the narrative of American life. The ruling in Buck v. Bell extended far beyond Carrie's own tragedy. With just as Oliver Wendell Holmes' infamous words, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Sterilization programs gained legal justification across the United States. Nearly 8,000 sterilizations occurred in Virginia alone, but across the nation, the numbers reached into the tens of thousands. Poor women, institutionalized men, the disabled, the mentally ill, immigrants, and disproportionately people of color became the silent victims of a system that believed it had the right to decide who was worthy of reproducing. What made Carrie's ordeal even more haunting was how it exposed the machinery of injustice cloaked as science. Doctors, lawmakers, and judges worked hand in hand to strip away the humanity of individuals under the pretense of social progress. Each operation was framed as an act of mercy or necessity, but in reality, it was torture disguised as medicine. The very institutions meant to protect and heal were turned into instruments of cruelty. Carrie's later years revealed the depth of the injustice She was eventually paroled from the institution, and records show she married twice. By all accounts, she lived quietly, working hard and never displaying the so-called deficiencies that had justified her sterilization. In fact, she was said to be kind, articulate, and capable, proof that the label of imbecile had been nothing more than a convenient lie. Even more tragic was her daughter, Vivian, labeled as feeble-minded in her school report to reinforce the Supreme Court's ruling. She actually showed average academic performance before her untimely death at just 8 years old. The system not only stole Carrie's ability to have children, it destroyed the truth about the child she already had. The shadow of Buck v. Bell stretched across decades. It wasn't until after World War II, when Nazi atrocities revealed the horrors of eugenics in its most extreme form, that Americans began to look back with unease at their own sterilization programs. Yet, even then, the decision was never overturned. To this day, Buck v. Bell remains technically valid law, though rendered obsolete by later cases and changing attitudes. The fact that it still sits, unrepudiated, in the annals of the Supreme Court is a chilling reminder of how cruelty can be codified as justice. Carrie herself passed away in 1983. She lived long enough to see history begin to shift, but she never saw justice for what had been taken from her. She never had the chance to undo the ruling that defined her life. Instead, her memory is carried forward by historians, advocates, and legal scholars who see her as both victim and symbol, a woman whose suffering became the cornerstone of one of the darkest decisions in American legal history. The true torture in Carrie Buck's story lies not in physical pain alone, but in the theft of her autonomy, the denial of her humanity, and the silence that followed her until her death. She was a prisoner of an ideology that sought to purify society by cutting away those it deemed unfit, and her case legitimized this cruelty for generations. Today, her story continues to echo in debates about human rights, reproductive freedom, and the dangers of unchecked state power. It is a warning carved into the very foundation of American law, a reminder that dignity, once stripped, leaves scars not just on individuals but on entire societies. Carrie's ordeal forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: the law, when devoid of empathy, can become the sharpest weapon of all. It wasn't just a case. It was a sentence imposed on thousands of lives across the nation. For Carrie, it meant living under the shadow of words that branded her and her family as unworthy. For others, it meant surgeries they never consented to, futures stolen without their knowledge. Her voice was never heard in the courtroom, her testimony never valued. But through history, her silence speaks louder than the justices who condemned her. Carrie Buck's story is not just about what was done to her. It is about what was allowed to happen to an entire generation under the banner of progress. And it is about the responsibility we carry today to ensure such cruelty is never repeated. This is why her case still matters. Because when we look at Carrie Buck, we see not only the past, but the ongoing struggle for autonomy, justice, and the recognition of humanity in every individual. Her life was defined by a court's decision, but her legacy is defined by the truth we continue to uncover. And as always, if this history unsettles you, it should. These stories must be told, not buried, because forgetting them would mean allowing them to happen again. Share this story, keep it alive, and remember Carrie Buck, a name that should forever remind us of the cost of injustice, disguised as law. You've been watching Torture's Room, where real history reveals the darkest corners of human cruelty. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and join us as we continue to uncover the stories that history tried to silence.